Make the choice to begin anywhere in your life, and the journey has started. And along the way, be inspired. Listen to the stories by joining the president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick, on The Journey.
At Howard, we are bound both to uphold the historic legacy of our esteemed university and to fulfill our responsibility of service to our society. We can only hope to realize this mission and preserve these core values if we develop an upright and upstanding institutional culture, as well as the infrastructure to maintain it. As we settle into being on campus this semester, every member of the Howard family has a role to play in ensuring the university's security and protecting our institution's reputation. Hello, my name is Dr. Wayne Frederick, and my guests today on the journey are Robert Clark, Howard University's Chief Compliance Officer, and Dr. Erica Alexander, Howard's Deputy Chief Compliance Officer. Mr. Clark and Dr. Alexander, welcome to the journey.
Thank you for having
President.
us.
Delighted to be here.
Good. So I'm going to start with you first, Mr. Clark. Let's jump right in. Compliance. Why compliance? How did you even find your way to compliance? And maybe you can start first by defining what compliance is.
Well, compliance is really just at the heart of every organization to make sure that we are operating consistently with our regulatory guidance. When we think of higher education, it is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the nation. We operate as an entire city. We've got research compliance, medical compliance, federal student aid, NCAA compliance, the list just goes on. So we operate as an entire city and a community. And compliance's role is really to be a part of the infrastructure to help to enable each of those functions to work successfully. Not to be in the way, to be the gotcha police, but really to be the enablers of identifying what the parameters are in which the university can operate and to provide that counsel and independent support to make sure that we're operating from a position of strength.
Right. Now, I don't meet a whole lot of high school kids. I have two in my own household, but I don't meet a whole lot of them that say, I'm going to become a compliance officer when I grow up. So tell us a little bit about your journey. Where did your journey start? Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Boston, started my career in auditing and compliance at MIT. And quite honestly, it was something that I did not think I was going to end up spending what has now been over 3 decades doing. Because I'm thinking, you know, everyone hates the auditors. Everyone hates the compliance people. They're always the people that people fear coming in and when they start knocking on your door. What I saw from the very first engagement that I ever got involved in, and I'm dating myself, but this is now counting petty cash funds. So this was back in the 80s. And the very first review that I ever did ended up uncovering over $25,000 in fraudulent transactions that ended up implicating 2 prominent people within that organization. And I just saw people's lives destroyed by that. And I became so passionate about wanting to try to ensure that that didn't happen again and not get caught up in the fact that I was now an expert witness in a court proceeding. I was just focused on how do we protect people from getting into this situation again, and really tried to think proactively about how we can put best practices in place. And 3 decades later, and a number of institutions later, at Georgia Tech in Nebraska, Clark Atlanta for the past 10 years before joining here, it's really something that I've found a passion for because I see the impact that we're able to have on helping to protect the rich legacy of our institutions.
And where did you go to school, and what degrees did you pursue that led to your auditing career?
I started out as a business major, as a business degree from Gordon College in Massachusetts, and after that pursued additional certifications as certified internal auditor, certified information systems auditor, certified compliance and ethics professional, really trying to just expand my portfolio of skill sets in that area.
Yeah. So Dr. Alexander, let's turn to you a bit. Probably my first question is, when I hear about things like compliance, I wonder whose responsibility is it? Is it the compliance officer's responsibility? What's your thought about compliance in terms of whose responsibility it is to uphold all of the regulatory things that Mr. Clark was just mentioning?
Well, it's kind of a trick question because honestly, it's everybody's responsibility. So whereas we may have a general expertise on where the parameters and the guidelines exist, when we operate and function in our roles every day, we should be upholding the right thing, and our goal is really to create that border to clearly define where the outliers exist, but everyone can uphold their own creative aspect of what they do and how they operationalize their role every day with our guidance to go alongside of it.
All right, so Dr. Hansen, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey, kind of where it started and how you got into a compliance role.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. I am a diehard Detroit Lions, Tigers, Pistons, Red Wings fan, you name it. So I went on from Detroit to school in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So I went to Western Michigan and I actually studied science. I'm a clinician by trade, so I'm an occupational therapist, and I got my master's in that area as well and practiced for a number of years. So I think naturally my compliance journey was embedded in my clinical practice. I think as anybody with a medical professional license, it's regulated by the state's Board of Medicine. You know what you can do, who you can supervise, the notes you sign, the way you have to document, and how to get credentialed for people to pay for it. So I think that kind of naturally puts you on a journey where you're protective of your practice. You want to make sure there's no barriers in the way of delivering treatment or care to the people you service.
Okay, and so what made you switch from clinical practice to a compliance role?
Well, that was a pretty interesting switch. I started progressing in leadership roles and running operational sides of clinics and things of that nature, and Medicare had a huge overhaul in payment systems, care delivery. HIPAA was increasingly looming, and so I had the COO of the organization I work for said, do you want to continue on the operations side or run compliance? You seem to kind of have a handle on this. I was like, no budgeting, no staffing needs. I take compliance all day long. I got that. So it was a very easy switch and migration, but I always had a great relationship with the providers and clinical staff I've worked with. So everybody kind of wants to know how to stay in the flow of things and out of the hot seat. So it bode well for me.
Right. So let's kind of get into the weeds over the next few minutes on kind of what we're trying to do here at Howard and why. So Robert, as you mentioned, there's a lot to cover. Athletics, you take any one of those buckets alone and it's enough to fill the day. Having said that, let's pick on a couple of those. Around athletics right now, especially when you look at name, image, likeness as a burgeoning issue, what do you see in the areas of compliance that you think trip up universities like a Howard, or should be red flags at a university, like a Howard University? And for listeners who may be wanting to attend or wanting to work here, what are the types of things they should be thinking as they come in or think of joining our environment?
From the athletic standpoint?
Yep.
Well, the name, image, and likeness is new regulation that has come out to actually afford students the opportunity to capitalize and to personally and financially benefit from the use of their name, image, and likeness. And this is new regulation that is somewhat uncharted in terms of how this is going to be enforced. So we are taking the position as the compliance office of walking alongside of the people who are within athletic compliance and with the athletic director and that whole team to really make sure that we have the appropriate guidance, the policies, the procedures, the education and awareness, and passing that on to our current and prospective student athletes so that they understand Howard's position in this and how we're going to be able to actualize all of that.
And to be very specific, I mean, last year around this time, if a student athlete went to the barbershop across the street from Howard and said, listen, I'll do a poster for you that I'll sign and I'll encourage people to come to the barbershop, you give me, free haircuts the rest of the semester, that would have been a violation.
Exactly.
Now it's not.
Right.
So, but how do you envision now trying to keep track? Because if you look at the number of athletes we have, and then the permutations around the number of those deals they can go cut with everybody from the barbershop to the, rental car folks across the street, how do you envision kind of even keeping track, or as you said, kind of riding herd with the athletic compliance office on that?
It's part of that really gets to the issue that we were talking about earlier in terms of education and awareness. And it's not only providing the appropriate guidance, but making sure that we're coaching each one of the students, not only on the field, but coaching them in this particular area so that they can make sure that they are navigating that in a way that is going to provide the appropriate level of transparency and visibility that is now required by the NCAA.
Right. And so, Erica, let's talk a little bit about healthcare. COVID has really changed how we deliver care. You now have a lot of healthcare professionals who are traveling nurses, as it were, or traveling occupational therapists, etc. They're making a lot more money, but they also are willing to stay at a place for a shorter period of time, which means that coming in, you've got to train and educate them about your environment, and then they leave. I often say that culture is a mixture of two things, right? People and tolerated behavior. So you have lots of new people coming in and out, and you have to convince them about what the tolerated behavior is, because the last place they came from, the tolerated behavior could either be where ours is, or it could be at a different standard. How do you envision tackling that problem with so much movement in the personnel?
Sure. I think I kind of have a unique lens. I was a travel therapist for 3 years, and you're right, there are kind of two different kinds coming in and out. I think that the perspective that I bring to tackling that is honestly the unique culture here at Howard. I think we service a very unique population, underserved, underinsured, and I think that the mission of the team members that we see here in healthcare and the students that are being educated to be our future providers have a deep sincerity to that mission and the people in this community. So people stick out like a sore thumb, honestly. And so there's a very strong sense of community and wanting to do the right thing and doing a little bit more and staying a little bit longer. We know this facet of our workforce didn't have a break. They didn't get to work virtually. And so there's something of that type of person that's cut from a different cloth. So while we welcome anybody who wants to roll up their sleeves and come and help, I think that it's very easy to leverage the goodness of the community we have here and start having some good catches and call outs, and so that everybody can be ingrained into the mission that really lies beneath what we do every day.
Right. And as you look into the future, how much of this you think we need to take more formally into the classroom for the health sciences students in particular?
Absolutely. I think that we're kind of building the plane as we're flying it, right? But I do think that a huge facet of delivering care is also being a good employee. And those are things that you kind of get on the job experience as early careerists and building up. But there's not a long runway anymore. You have to be able to jump in right away. And your ability to deliver care safely, quickly, and effectively has to start in the classroom. And some of those runways exist as internships and fellowships, but these are the times we really want to get our students exposed so that they're ready to run day one.
Right. And Robert, you launched a hotline recently, so that those things are obviously very critical to an organization like ours. It's a complicated organization, but at the same time, you want people to feel comfortable, kind of they see something, reporting it, so that we can make sure that we get on top of it. Maybe you could tell our listeners a bit about that hotline and how you envision it working.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that, and thank you for your support in helping to put that in place. When you look at the elements of a well-functioning, healthy, mature, ethical organization, one of the principles is that we want to allow people to have the means by which to bring issues forward if they identify particular areas with which they might feel uncomfortable. Maybe they're witnessing a practice that they're not quite sure is consistent with the Code of Ethical Conduct or our policies and procedures, and to whom do they escalate that? And people are often thinking, well, if I escalate that to my supervisor, that might put me in a position where they are seeing me as being somebody who is disloyal, or that might end up adversely impacting me in my performance appraisal. So to whom can we go, and how can we report this anonymously in a way that is able to ensure that that is independently investigated or reviewed? And putting in place the hotline, which we have, is now a The Ethics Point Hotline. It is a industry best practice in higher education where it affords people the opportunity to raise issues completely anonymously and confidentially through either phone calls, web interface, mobile device, and actually allows us to have ongoing anonymous communications with somebody in such a way that if there is additional information that we need to get from them to clarify what their particular issue is, we can do so anonymously. And having done this before at other institutions, what I've seen is how that changes the culture. It increases people's confidence to know that they do have a voice and that they do not have to have the fear of retaliation in bringing issues forward. It's less of it's not a snitch hotline, it's not a tattletale issue. It's really more of an effective way for people to be able to bring issues forward so that they know it is going to be heard. And that's one of the biggest issues that people sometimes feel, is they just want to be heard.
Now, two things with hotlines that always concern me. One is, because it's anonymous, you can't give feedback to the person. So although an issue may be resolved, it's sometimes difficult to give feedback. As you're saying, that person may observe that something has changed, but it could be a circumstance where they have no way of knowing that it has changed. And then the second one is that in terms of while you compile, my sense is that most of what you find isn't being done out of malice or out of somebody having very poor intent or trying to break the rules, etc. A lot of times, my suspicion is that it's out of ignorance, somebody not knowing the rules, or something changing that somebody isn't aware of. So with those two things in mind, how do you then manage that so that people grow in confidence that things are getting fixed on one hand, and that two, that while people may be seeing things that they want to bring forward, it's not always because somebody's trying to do something wrong. How do you manage those two issues?
Well, the first issue, I'll address that in terms of the anonymous communication and letting the person know what has happened from that. Now, obviously, we don't have we're not duty bound to let the person know exactly what the outcome of that was, but there is a process whereby within our system, it allows us that case management tracking where we can actually put within the documentation and communicate with the reporter if they set up that anonymous password that allows them to have that type of communication to which I earlier referred. That gives us an opportunity to, number one, thank them for bringing the issue forward, and then to indicate what the status is, that it is being reviewed or it has been reviewed. And that way we at least get a chance to kind of close the circle on that so people are not wondering, I wonder whatever happened with that. That's the first issue. In terms of the type of issues that are brought forward, and you're right, not everyone is going to bring up issues. This is not the forum in which for people to raise concerns over, well, they didn't like their last performance appraisal. That's not what this is for. It's really intended to be used for instances in which people suspect that there might be some non-compliance with an established policy and procedure. But to the point that you just mentioned, sometimes that's because things have changed and people might not necessarily be aware of that. And what that tells us, part of the feedback that Eric and I are working on when we see these reports, is we're trying to evaluate what is this data telling us. And in some cases, we see, you know what, there's probably an opportunity for additional training, education, and awareness of some of the policies that have changed so that the rest of the campus community and stakeholders are aware of that. In other cases, it might be that we need to have some additional conversations with or refer some of these things to the appropriate stakeholders at the university, whether that's HR, finance, other key leaders, where they might be able to then offer counsel to the people who are named in a situation so that we can provide appropriate coaching on that.
Right. And for both of you, we will touch on this with respect to research, but starting with you first, Erica. In the news recently, we've heard again about the Henrietta Lacks issue. The family is now suing a company around it. There's a lot in the news about the role that Johns Hopkins University may have played in it. Again, it may not be violating any specific policy, and I think especially at the time period that this happened, but clearly there's an ethical issue undergirding that. And I just wonder, in terms of even the training, HIPAA is clear. You can't let people's information get out, you protect it, but there's some of these areas that may be considered gray areas. It's not clear, it doesn't feel right. So there's clearly something there. And I like to describe things like compliance as, you may not be able to define it fully, but once you see it, you know it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, how do you create that culture around those ethical issues that may come up with patient care or patient research in particular, where there's not a clear line, but you sensitize people so that when they see something or they're getting ready to participate in something that doesn't feel right, they can stop themselves long enough to pick up the phone and say, listen, I'm not sure about this. Can you give me some guidance?
Yeah, I think sometimes that just happens as being a trusted messenger, and it's multiple conversations at a time. It's being visible, being available. Rob and I like to say we live in the gray area. For example, I had the privilege of meeting all the freshman medical students this summer as part of their orientation. And a good part of my conversation with them is what I call situations and solutions. Throw up a situation, some things are like this, but it's not the black and white issue. Where's the policy? Where's the law? It's what feels wrong about this? Is it against the law? Is it against the policy? How would this impact my shareholders and stakeholders? How would I feel if this was on the front page of my social media? And so I'm inviting the thought and the inward look of, how does this feel to me, and how does this feel about the greater community in which I service? Because sometimes it could be legal on policy, but it's still not the right thing to do. Yeah. And so asking those whys and starting those conversations, be it from, freshman year in medical school, all the way up to our seasoned professionals that work in the clinics day to day, have been doing something the same way for 30 years and hadn't even thought of the notion of changing or looking at it differently. So I think that's the best first step in creating this dialogue and this inward look into what feels right about this or doesn't.
And as we look into the future, what can we expect from the compliance office in terms of the health sciences arena?
Well, it's an exciting time to be on the health sciences side. We have a lot of things going on, and being led by Dean Mighty is just a gift in itself. He's very knowledgeable, and he runs directly into the fire when you talk about COVID and vaccinations and standing up these things overnight. So once again, there's a lot of deregulation right now because of states of emergency and so on and so forth. So it gives us a really good time to innovate and create and smooth over and reimagine the way our policies should be in the future and these guidelines and protocols. But not from me, not from Rob, from our stakeholders and our clinicians. So I'm in the clinics, I'm walking through, I'm hearing side by side what works and what doesn't work, and so that we can put it back together and be on track and forward thinking and thought leaders, not reacting to pandemics or scenarios that come up.
Sure. And Rob, you're the captain and the quarterback of the entire team. As I said, this has to be an important part of our culture. It has to be embedded. And it's obviously about our people, but it's about the tolerated behavior. When you look down the road 3-5 years from now, when you think of the impact that compliance has, what are the things that people will do voluntarily? What are some of the things that people will, not just pick up a hotline, but even call your office and say, I'd like to talk to you about this, etc. What do you see, and what should we be expecting as an organization that's going to get us to what you see as your utopia around us having that type of culture and environment?
Well, it starts with how you introduce that question. It starts with your position of the importance of compliance within the organization, because that tone at the top sets the tone for the entire organization. So the fact that you introduced it in a way that demonstrates that this is important to you, we are positioned to try to really just carry out your vision, and that's that which is supported by the board as well. As Erica is diving into the health sciences part of it, what we're looking to do is to expand the type of coverage that we have in proactively identifying areas of risk, compliance risk within every other area of the operation. We talked about athletics before, you mentioned research, we talked about federal student aid, within the financial operations, within our information systems posture. There are compliance and regulatory obligations with which we are required to comply. We need to make sure that we are ahead of the curve, we're identifying what's coming down the pike, and that we're well positioned to try to do exactly what you said at the beginning of our talk today, which is asking the question, where does compliance belong? And really, an effective compliance function is one in which we are helping to undergird and support those compliance oversight measures that are taking place in each operational unit, and that we are there to equip them to be fully successful, and that we can be a resource as they're developing some of those things on the front lines, and to be that independent set of eyes and ears to provide that feedback, to provide the appropriate course corrections along the way so that we can be well positioned. My vision is that in the coming few years here, that the compliance function at Howard University is going to be recognized as best in class, not just in our geographical area, not just in the HBCU community, but in the rarefied air of top-tier institutions. As we grow in Howard forward, as we're looking to achieve all those strategic objectives, we want the compliance function to actually be walking alongside of and being an enabling force to allow us to achieve those objectives.
Thanks for being here. My guests today were Robert Clark, Howard University's Chief Compliance Officer, and Dr. Erica Alexander, Howard's Deputy Chief Compliance Officer. I think you'd agree with me that we can have the best strategic plan in Howard forward, but we certainly can't maintain an institution without having a very strong compliance function to marry that with. I'm Dr. Wayne Frederick. Please join me next time on The Journey.
This program was produced by WHUT and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. For more information on this program or any other program, please visit our website at whut.org. Thank you.